So welcome everybody. Nice to see a lot of faces of people. Some I know, some I don't. Welcome to the new social reality we got here. So for those who don't know, this is the first Mekuvan Session for Jerusalem. It's the first of 6. And I hear somebody's making some background noise. Maybe that was Reuven. I cut him off. So yeah. This is Mekuvan, the first of 6 sessions, where we got Erika Meitner here with us today. Thanks for coming out, Erika. And,
Hi.
okay. And then after years of in-person meetings, this is our attempt to check out what we can do online and see how we can keep on connecting people literally. I'm really glad that so many amazing poets like Erika decided to participate with these meetings. And even though we're engaging online and we're exploring what it means to kind of connect in ways where distance seems like it's less relevant, I hope also to do a lot of reflecting on place and our connection to places and how space and place still plays a role, or how maybe it doesn't so much anymore, and what that has to do with connecting between people and also with poetry and literature. So about Erika, I really hope people saw online the full bio. It's available. You probably got some emails, or you can see it on the Facebook page, or you can just find it. So I'm not going to read all that for you, but I just wanted to point out that for me, it was really nice to have Erika here because she's just an accomplished poet in and of herself. She's, I think, about 5 books. Is that right now you've published?
Yep.
5 books, and she's also won some awards, which is amazing. And personally, my interest in her work as I started to read it is just, I would say it's a kind of willingness and an ability to go there in a special way. And by going there, I mean that Erika takes straight on very relevant political and issues like gun control, or she talks a lot about taboos around writing about women and their bodies. And I think the willingness to go there, and also just doing it in a way that is both interesting and kind of veers away from sometimes a lot of political discussion, I think, can just end up being superficial, but Erika does it in interesting and exciting ways. I hope we get to hear some of that when she reads. And with kind of that stuff in mind, I wanted to start before reading to ask Erika a few questions and just talk to her about her special relationship with Israel and Jerusalem, which is where most of us, I think, are tuning in from. So hi, Erika. How are you doing?
Hi. Thank you for having me. This is great. This is my first reading I've done on your time zone, where people who are in the time zone can actually participate. So I'm really grateful for that. I think it's very cool to have an audience that's halfway across the world.
Sure.
So Israel. So yeah. So my father is Israeli. He was born in Haifa on the Carmel, and you know, like many Jewish families, everyone ended up everywhere after both right before, during, and after the Holocaust, depending on where fate took them. And so my father's family escaped Czechoslovakia in the very early 40s and settled in Haifa. And so as a kid, I would go over and visit my family there in the summers. They, of course, practiced their English on me, so my Hebrew is still terrible. My mother's family, my grandmother's sister, actually, she survived the war with 2 of her sisters. They survived Auschwitz and a host of concentration camps, and her youngest sister, Anja, also lived in Haifa, in Navi Shanaan. And so when I went over, I would see both sides of my family, and my grandmother would usually take me over. And then I returned to Israel a bunch of times as a teenager. And then when I graduated college, I went over to Hebrew University and studied at the Rothberg International School and lived in Jerusalem for a year.
Oh, wow.
And got to know my cousins as grown-ups, which was really fun. And I hadn't been back actually in 20 years until I came back. It was already, I think, 2 years ago, to do an event at Bar Ilan University, which is when I met Lonnie and a bunch of people who were in the audience. So it's lovely to see everybody that I met last time I was, or sort of see you, see your names, sometimes see you.
Sure.
Who
So,
I met when I was over last time.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, so, I mean, I read a little bit, you mentioned somewhere else about the connection with your father, and I didn't know that you had, you've been coming here and you came to study here. So what do you think, or how do you see that connecting to your work over the years too? If your poetry, if someone reads your poetry, are they going to know any of this? Has it worked its way into your poetry? Or if not directly, do you think maybe in indirect ways, stylistically or forms or anything like that?
I think it definitely has. I mean, I grew up in New York City and Queens and Long Island. And one of the things that struck me when I moved to Jerusalem specifically, that also happens when I'm in New York, is there's such energy and history in both places. Jerusalem, obviously, more so than New York in terms of the history,
Mhm.
that I actually found it really hard to write in those places. I had to kind of be there, then leave them in order to be able to write about them even a little. When I moved to Israel, I had actually thought I would either go on to be a rabbi or do a degree in Hebrew and Comp literature, because my job actually, while I was in college for the summers, I was working as a production assistant for Bill Moyers, the PBS host, on the Book of Genesis series that he did years ago. It's like over 20 years ago now, and met all of these biblical scholars who inspired me to want to do that. But after a year in Jerusalem, I decided I wasn't sure if I wanted to be in charge of anyone's spiritual development. And so I went back to the US and I took a corporate job. And I ended up eventually, after I got my MFA in poetry, doing most of a PhD in Jewish studies.
Hmm.
So I spent 13 years while I was working full time, actually as a poet for part of it, working on my PhD in, it was in ritual studies and anthropology and Judaism. So I was studying new Jewish rituals with a scholar named Vanessa Oakes, who's wonderful,
So
and going
with
around
your
and
work,
asking.
do you think about the ritual aspect with your work? I'll be honest with the poems that I've looked at so far, I wouldn't have thought of them like getting brought in. Yeah, I didn't see a direct maybe connection to religion as most people think of it.
Right. So Vanessa's specialty is actually material religion, which is the study of objects and things and practices. So the two ways it's influenced my work is, first, I was trained in anthropology to go out and interview people. So a lot of my work is sort of documentary poetry, where I end up going on the road with photographers to do field work around social issues and write poems from it. The second way is that a lot of my work has imagery in it around the material world. Like, it's very rooted in the material world, and there's a lot of human geography in my poems, and I think that interest sort of comes out of my training there, and also Jewish text. So I think like that definitely influenced my work for sure in terms of my approaches to it.
Very cool. So, and then thinking still about your ongoing relationship to Israel, even in that last visit, did that was yeah was that did you learn a lot about maybe English language literature going on here? Were you already kind of aware of what was going on, and has that shifted maybe any of the way you think about or practice your poetry and surrounding stuff?
You know, I think like everywhere else, there was always like a literary scene around Timol Shoshone and some of the other bookstores and venues, and the big festival that I'm forgetting the name of, the literary fest. I mean, Israel has a huge literary culture, more so than the US, I think.
Hmm.
I think the difference seemed to be that poetry was much more in the forefront, and there are a lot more young poets doing it.
Hmm.
And there seemed to be more communities of younger writers this time around than when I had lived there in 1996 and 97.
Hmm.
And that was really nice to see.
Cool. So yeah, thinking of these active literary communities and readings, before you read for us online, do you mind sharing some of your thoughts about this whole movement to online stuff? I imagine you had the opportunity before a few months ago to participate in so many readings and conferences. Is there something you miss about that, or are you kind of okay with giving up the schlep out to these places and connecting in this way?
No, I mean, I think I definitely miss, I miss being on the road, because being in a place and meeting the people there in person in an embodied way is
Mm.
really different than doing it this way. I think the advantages for me is I live in rural Southwest Virginia, 30 miles from the West Virginia border. So in order to get anywhere, even if it was just domestic, it was like a full day of travel. So
Mm.
this definitely allows me to interact with a lot more people without it being as schleppy. The downside is that everyone knows, I think, that to really experience a place, whether domestically or internationally, it's about the food and the people and the atmosphere and the sense details. And those are things we try to write our way into, but you can't replicate the smells of a place, right?
Sure.
Um, or you know, the way, the particular angle of the sun, or the way the light bounces off the buildings. Like, that's very specific, and you want to be there and embody it.
Mm. So with that in mind, also, do you have any interesting or extreme kind of memories from readings that maybe you want to share now that we're thinking back to when we still met? Like, was there anything that especially inspiring or extreme maybe happened in a reading that maybe can't happen now? There,
I mean, the one nice thing about reading over Zoom is, right, like anyone who's an author knows sometimes you show up to a reading and there's like one person and the barista in the bookstore. And so that hasn't been happening. We've actually been getting pretty good crowds for the events I've either been organizing or, you know, participating in. The other thing is random sort of sound in the background. Like, often when I'd read in New York in bars, there'd be like subways and sirens and the espresso machine, and you don't get that now. So that's kind of nice. The other fun part about doing online readings, though, is you can show visuals in a way that you couldn't um, in analog readings. But
sure.
it is a little weird, because you're putting out a performance into a void. And in some of the platforms, I haven't been able to see the people I'm reading to at all. Here I can see some of you, and so that's really nice. I can see your faces. Um, and so you don't get that energy of the crowd back, and so that's different.
Hmm. So hopefully we get some feedback energy with the crowd. And yeah, you talking about using the multimedia makes me excited to. I think you're going to be showing us some pictures. So maybe you want to start with the reading, and then we'll have some time for question and answer afterwards.
Sure, that sounds good.
Awesome.
um I'm gonna screen share for the first poem, but not all of them,
Okay.
just because I want you all to see the picture that goes with it. And then for some of the other ones, I'll just read them. Um, but so I'm gonna read probably for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, and then I'll stop, and Lonnie will probably have more questions, and you all might have questions. So in addition to writing poems based on my life that are maybe more narrative, I've also been going on the road to do these larger scale documentary poetry projects on different cities. And so for the past 2 years, I've been working on a project in Miami with a photographer named Anna Maria Barry Jester on sea level rise and architecture in Miami and global warming. And so I thought I'd read a poem from that and show you a picture. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay, let me see. Hang on. Oh, I'm still figuring out the technology a little bit. Okay. Can everyone see this mammoth in a glass case? Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. So so this is on the beach at a hotel in South Beach called the Fina, and it's a Damien Hirst sculpture. And so I wrote an apocalypse poem that was inspired by this particular sculpture. Eternal return to, because in this kingdom of unlikely wonders, we never saw it with our eyes, not the smaller signs or the larger erasures. All came scattershot, like the wind rushing headlong through torn screens, carrying the laughter of strangers. Until extinction stops being forever, I'll pitch everything I have against death. Muscle memory, tenacity, my whirls and spires, my lips. When we do the hard work of extricating ourselves from these systems, when they suture us back together to create something more vaguely eternal, more hope than terror, like Miami's golden mammoth in a glass vitrine, coffin at the Fina, 24-karat mythological beast interred at the head of the dwindling beach, the menacing sea. Tell me we'll be all right. When the sun comes up, there's our desire, the world, its terroir, the taste of your skin, illuminated like the calf Moses burned, then ground to smithereens. He scattered those ashes on the water, forced the people to drink. Remember, after each day comes night. There will be a time when the earth stops answering. Pray for an aperture. Okay. So I'm going to kick it old school next and read from my actual book. So this is my last book, Holy Moly Carry Me, which came out in 2018 in the fall. And this is a poem called Diaspora that is about the, so I think New Yorkers have this weird thing about, it suddenly dawned on me that my children will not be New Yorkers. And this was shocking to me. Like it pained my heart. And so this is sort of a poem about taking my son on the subway. And right now it's actually really hard. My folks are still in New York and I can't go see them and I don't know when I'll be able to go see them. So this has become a sort of New York nostalgia poem now. Diaspora. I am riding the F train to Brooklyn with my son, who is Appalachian as much as anything, who is 6 and does not notice the Hasidic women reading Tehillim on their way home, praying psalms from worn leather-bound Sidurim, moving their lips past Broadway, 2nd Avenue, Delancey, and he would not know to identify them by their below-the-knee skirts, the filled-in parts of their shadels where scalps should be visible, or the Brighton Beach men in gray fedoras with threatening hand tattoos speaking Russian, the occasional wondrous mosaic murals or regular green and white tiles, spelling station names, Bergen Street, Carroll Street, Smith and 9th Street. My son discovering that he can see his own reflection in the windows of the cars when they plunge into dark tunnels while the women's lips keep moving. And I want to tell him I know their kind, though I know to say this is reductive or offensive, even if I might say it too about the bleach blonde with the septum ring or the old Russian mobsters. So when he says, it's hard to believe that you got off here every day, I agree, and think of all the times I climbed the station stairs or felt the give of metal turnstiles on my hips, the jangle of apartment keys or click of my own heels on pavement after a night out too late, the car service guys playing dominoes on overturned crates outside the bodega who didn't look up, and the way the trains still vibrate beneath the surface with exactly the same frequency they always did, blowing hot air through the grates, rattling me to the bone with foreboding joy. And I want to tell him, I know this exact moment, the one where you finally learn the contours of your own face, its beauty as it hurtles through darkness. So that was, that's one New York nostalgia poem. I'm gonna read another new poem. So this is an interesting poem. This is from a new book I just finished that's with my publisher. I still don't know if they're gonna take it or not. So it would be my 6th book. So when the elections happened here, gosh, how long ago was that? I don't even know. It seems like in 3 years, it seems like a millennium. I was in the middle of having a kind of midlife crisis in my mid 40s. And I ended up striking up a correspondence, or maybe she struck up one with me, with a millennial who is in the middle of a quarter life crisis. And her name was Hillary, which was bizarre. Like, we started around the election, Hillary Clinton lost. And me and this millennial poet named Hillary started writing back and forth to each other these poem letters. And these are real letters we sent to each other, but they were in the form of poems. And so we kept it up for a while. And what was interesting about Hillary was she had grown up here near where I live in Roanoke, Virginia, but lived in New York. And I had grown up in New York where she was living in Queens, near where she was living in Queens, but lived where she had grown up. And we were both nostalgic for the other places. And we had this intergenerational exchange for a long time. And I wrote about this a little bit in the journal Image, which is a religious journal, about how it was sort of like a Hevruta, but for life skills. Like, she would advise me, I would advise her. So this is one of the letters to Hillary I thought I'd read. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is that there's a cameo by my cousin Inga in here, because it's based around Thanksgiving, who is actually a hidden child during the war. She was hidden by a Polish farm family, and then my grandfather and my great uncle went back and had to kidnap her with Russian soldiers to take her back from the Polish family. So she has a cameo in there. And the other person who has a cameo is my aunt, who's a Chilean Jew. My family really is like from all over. So there's Chilean food in here too. Letter on gratitude. Hillary, it's the night after Thanksgiving and everyone is asleep. I'm in the living room of my childhood home. My father has installed a timer that turns lights on automatically. The timer sounds like the fuse to a homemade bomb. My Chilean aunt made flan and brazo de reina for second Thanksgiving. An ex posts a shirtless photo of himself by a window. I wondered if he had a Thanksgiving at all, the way the sunlight cut across his body. My sons were piled on their cousins, watching Teen Titans Go. My uncle is dying slowly. My sister's baby, we passed her around like a potato. When she cried, we bounced from the knees. When she cried, my mother made jokes about putting her up for adoption, told one cousin to have another child, told the other about my sister's 23 frozen eggs, forgot my cousins are infertile, forgot my son is adopted. I ate fruit and brownie pie and flan and brazo de reina. I helped clear the table. I listened to my mother's cousin talk about the war. She told us about a man with 2 dachshunds on the train with Uncle Jack to the DP camp at Bergen-Belsen. She was an orphan by then. The opera singer that met us at the Port Authority, she said. Her nails were manicured, and I was so impressed. The stupid things you remember, she said. My sister made us go around to announce our gratitudes, and I felt impossibly empty. I felt very still. I wanted to say I had dim sum. I saw exhibits. I wandered the strangely deserted streets of Soho at night. I said my family, but what I meant was my desire. When I was younger, I thought I could return indefinitely toward the body of the city, always slightly unchanged and somehow waiting for me. Late afternoon shadows splayed on the faces of buildings, in that golden light and traffic, nothing needing me, my gratitude or praise. So that's another newish one. I'll probably do, maybe I'll do one more from the book. I think, so this is an interesting poem. It's a friend of mine was putting together an anthology about, it was called the Book of Uncommon Prayer, and it was based on the Protestant Book of Common Prayer. And he said, will you write a poem for us that's a prayer. And I said, well, Judaism has fixed liturgy, so that would be a little weird, but I can write you a blessing. So I ended up writing this poem about my town where I live in now. It's a college town. We have about 15,000 people that live in the town, but it's a university town. So every fall we get 30,000 students who come to town to take classes. They're all gone right now because of coronavirus, and also graduation actually happened yesterday on Zoom. But when we have football games, another 40,000 people come to town. So this is a poem about the day after a football game, when I'm on a class trip with my son's class, and sort of how everything looks. Post game day blessing. Bless the black G-string, abandoned on the sidewalk, beside a green ginkgo sapling on Lee Street. Bless the girl who shimmied out of it before dawn, drunk on Curacao or triple sec or Mike's hard lemonade, drunk on lust and early autumn, and our team's unexpected win over Georgia Tech. Bless our team, all defense, no offense. Bless everyone who must have been downtown last night with their car flags and war whoops, mesh jerseys, and micro minis. Bless our star quarterback on fire with a 14-3 halftime lead. We are on the first grade class walking trip to the library so everyone can get their own cards. I am chaperone, which means herding kids out of traffic back over the curb. Bless the curb and the kids who use it as a balance beam. Bless the magical book drop. Bless the girl with knotted hair who tries to stuff orange leaves into the slot. And bless the librarian, too, who reads a book loudly, clearly, to everyone about someone reading a spooky book. Bless the meta story and the mass of first graders descending on the stacks like locusts. Bless the red solo cups on the return trip, congregating like plastic flames, like oversized maraschino cherries on the early morning lawns of Phi Delt, SIGEP, any dilapidated white house with a porch couch on East Roanoke Street. Bless the empty bottles of PBR knocked on their sides, mouths open in wondrous O's. Oh, rushing yards. Oh, Bud Light Lime in your crushed cardboard case resting on the elementary school lawn. Bless my son and his friend Major, who looked past the blue Trojan wrapper on Jackson Street, the flattened Miller Lite can on Bennett, to the blue butterfly, to the giant mushroom blooming in the corner of someone's yard. It looks like a piece of meat, says my son, or a tree stump, says Major matter-of-factly. It is a mushroom worth blessing, and bless our team for escaping Bobby Dodd Stadium with a 17-10 win. Bless us for being able to hold on despite the onslaught. Thank you. So I'm gonna stop here, see if Lonnie has questions or anyone else has questions. Sure. I can always read another poem somewhere in there eventually.
Sure, and again, I mean, we kind of gave some time parameters, but at the same time, as long as people are asking questions and stuff, I think we can keep going. And if you want to read some more poems, that sounds great to me. I definitely have like a follow-up question, but if Reuven also wants to like help figure out who wants to ask questions, if someone wants to write it, Reuven can read it, or if you want to like raise your hand and we'll just unmute you, that's fine. But while we do that, thanks again for the reading. It's really nice. One of the things you made me think of a lot is, especially thinking of Jewish experience, I think there's often a discussion of exile and Jewish experience, which is funny because usually it's exile can mean a lot of things, but I think one of the physical things is not being in Israel. But for you, it seems to be not being in New York is your kind of exile.
I'm in like what I call a diaspora of a diaspora. Sure. And so it's like this weird place where I'm even in a diaspora for the US, where I'm not in a big Jewish community, like we don't have a rabbi, all of these other things. So it's like this 3 times removed diaspora of, US and then outside of a major city.
And then another thing that just I thought of before the reading that I'd love to ask before quickly while I have you is this idea of taboo for you. I think you've talked about or written about how facing taboos and writing about taboos is a big part of your work. And for you, I think I saw mentioned was this idea of the woman's body is just not discussed openly or realistically or some combination of the two. I don't know if you want to share more thoughts about that, or also do you think is that the main one that you're taboo that you feel like you're facing, or are there others, or that you're either going to work on or do come up in your writing?
I mean, it's interesting. So when I was writing this book, Holy Moly, Carry Me, um, a lot of the poems have to do with gun culture and gun violence because I teach at Virginia Tech, which was the site of the what was the largest gun massacre in U.S. history, but then became the second largest after Orlando and Las Vegas. So around here, talking about gun culture and gun violence openly was still somewhat taboo because of the trauma of people kind of around here, but also just generally how bifurcated and polarized the US is politically. The book also deals, though, with infertility and some of my struggles around secondary infertility, which is also something that people don't talk about openly. And so in that way, that particular aspect of reproductive technology in women's bodies is, I think, buried a lot, partially because we don't have anything other than the medicalized language to talk about it. The book I just finished that the Thanksgiving poem is from talks a lot about midlife female desire, which is also, I think, like one of the biggest taboos, I think, still is like aging female bodies. People are like, no. So I think, taboos can be local. They can be things that are within your particular micro community. They can be more sort of locational. So for example, I live in the American South where people would never say the phrase, oh my God, but I grew up in New York where that's very common. So I've trained myself to say, oh my gosh, because if not, I offend people. So taboos can be really micro to your region or to your micro community or just to your social community. Or they can be much more, global. And I think certainly aging women's bodies is something that's like a more global taboo, not tattoo.
Also a taboo.
I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Taboo, but so I think I always tell my students to push into their taboos and write into them, whatever they are, whether they're more universal taboos or things that are just taboo for even their peer group, because I think it can lead to really fruitful poems.
Cool. So I'm also seeing some people are asking questions. I don't know. First, I see Geula typed it out, but I'm going to unmute her and see if she wants to ask it herself.
Okay. It's good. I'm sitting in the other room, so my kid can hear me. So thank you so much. I really loved your reading, and I especially related a lot to the Thanksgiving poem, where I like the way you very deftly, weave the different characters that are sitting around the table and the different members of your family, and the way they affect you personally, and obviously the very intense comments of your mom. So I'm wondering also, like, obviously on your mother-daughter relationship and how it affects, motherhood in general, how it affects your writing, and also the topic of your writing. I just want to ask you, because I read your letter of exchange with Joy Katz on what's her name? God, I forgot the book.
Brenda Shaughnessy.
Yes, thank you. Okay, the liquid flesh poems and all of them. So just because I'm very interested in postpartum writing at the moment, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
So Joy Katz actually has a great essay in American Poetry Review called something like "A Baby Comes into the Poem" or "There's a Baby in the Poem," and it's all about sentimentality and motherhood and how taboo it still is to some extent, even though it shouldn't be, to write about certain things. And part of her essay was actually inspired by something that's in there that she adopted as, I gave her permission to adopt it as hers, but I did a reading after I wrote my book, Ideal Cities, which has a lot to do about my son's, the birth of my first son. and postpartum stuff. And I read from the book, and a male poet came up to me and said, I usually don't like motherhood poems, but yours are okay. And it was this comment that was like, it was clearly meant as a compliment, but it was like the worst possible.
Yeah.
It just underscored everything to me that is problematic with the way that sometimes these poems are received, and the models we have are like, you know, Plath, who writes beautifully about her children, but in this incredibly dire way where everything is like emergency. You know, that tonally somehow there's like a tone police out there saying you have to write about motherhood in a particular way or it's not okay. I think one of the things I grapple with a lot in my work lately, and this, you can see this in the Thanksgiving poem too, is like the coterie of people online who are like, here we'd call them sort of like #blessed, this idea that we always have to be grateful for everything and practice gratitude and mindfulness and teach our children to practice gratitude or we're terrible people. And for someone like me who has a sort of Black Jewish sense of humor, where like my grandmother was like such a good example of this, right? She survived Auschwitz. She didn't start talking about the war till she was in her 80s. And one day she told me the whole story of how she survived the war, and she was a nurse midwife, but she was working night shift in a munitions factory as an electrician. And I called her Baba and I said, Baba, what did you know about being an electrician? And she paused and she looked at me and she said, that's why the Germans won the war. And like, just this like deeply Black sense of humor where everything is like a little bit dark, I think runs through my work at least, but colors a lot of my response to both motherhood and things where I'm supposed to be, you know, grateful or sentimental or feel a certain way and I don't. And I like trying to capture that tension. Does that kind of answer your question, maybe?
Yes, it does. I mean, it also connects to what you were saying previously about taboos and what Lonnie was saying about going there and thinking about ways. A next question would be like, how, with what like tools and with what form? You know, I mean, you have a very like straightforward, very direct style also in your everyday objects that you blend with your in your poems, which feels so natural. So you really maintain this very everyday kind of language. So maybe that gives you the possibility to put in those taboos, which really just become a part of the everyday scenery that you're describing.
And I think part of that is a response to when I was writing for a while, I found I was ironing out real life from my poems because it didn't seem poetic, right? So like I spent most of my time in like Walmart parking lots buying enormous boxes of diapers, but I was like, this is not worthy of a poem. Like, why how can I write a poem about this? It's not poetic. And once I let go of that idea that there was something distinctly poetic or unpoetic about things intrinsically, it became much easier to include real life and real objects and brand names and pop culture and other things in my work in a way that felt right and also had some kind of emotional weight to them. Because it turns out when people are having like emotional breakthroughs or moments, usually they're like in their car in a strip mall parking lot, not like on a very scenic mountaintop somewhere, was my experience at least. So.
It will be interesting to see what you do with that after Corona, during Corona, the scenery of your everyday life.
It's been interesting, actually. One of my teachers was the poet Charles Wright, who's a really wonderful American poet. And the running joke about Charles is that like he only writes about his backyard. He's like he's a misanthrope, a lovely person, but almost never leaves his backyard and writes all of his poems about his backyard. And there's something now that's feels very comforting that he was able to produce a lifetime of work without really like, you know, it's sort of the Emily Dickinson model, right? So.
So, Yeah, I hope your question was addressed, if not totally answered, Gula. Thank you. And I just wanted to also, somebody chatted or through the chat sent me an anonymous question. If you don't mind, he or she asked if you would offer any advice for new poets who don't have ways to get funding to get a degree in writing poetry, I guess. What should you do?
So I don't know what the situation is in Israel. In the US, our MFA program is actually, like, the one I run offers full funding to anyone who applies and gets in. So one thing might be to potentially apply to school in the US. But the other thing I would say is right now, particularly, there are tons of free online, like, webinars, seminars, and different things that people are doing and giving. So, like, my friend Amy Nezekuma-Tatil on Tuesday is doing a free hour-long How to Write Nature Poetry workshop. And so, like, digging around on the internet right now will turn up a ton of free classes that even pretty famous poets are giving. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of this bizarre moment in time and seek out some of those things that people are doing to give back to the community that don't cost anything and that you could probably Zoom into in some way, shape, or form, even if it means getting up for you at 7 in the morning or something insane. So yeah.
Online resources. You're reminding me, I don't know for other people, but for me years ago, the ModPo program, even before all this started, was just an amazing online resource too. So I'll throw that out there if anybody doesn't know.
And I'll put the name of my friend who's doing the nature thing on Tuesday. In case you want to Google her, you should be pretty easily able to find it. And she's a wonderful teacher.
Very cool. So, I mean, I guess unless somebody else has a question they want to try to pipe up right now and let us know that they want to ask, I would suggest maybe if you had, I think you did have another poem or two you wanted to read before we finish up.
Sure, I can do that.
Let's do it. We got you here. Let's go all the way.
So I'm gonna read one I think about. So this is a poem about parenting and also about an immigration protest. So my local congressman here in rural Southwest Virginia is a horrifying person who's completely anti-immigrant. And so a whole bunch of us in town last year, back when we could still protest in person, had a huge protest outside his office when we figured out that when the news broke that the US was keeping unaccompanied minors essentially in cages and in lockdown in various ways. So this is a poem about that protest and about my own family history. One of the things that happened is this congressperson doesn't really meet with his constituents, but one of my friends managed to score a meeting with him via a lottery he has. So she brought me with her and I told him my family's immigration story and I made him cry, which was like this huge point of pride for me. So that wends its way into the poem. Before I start, I just want to show one thing here. So let me see if this works. Uh-oh, that's not what I wanted to share. Hang on, let me try that one more time and see. Okay. I think maybe that was what I wanted to share. It was just on the wrong page. Okay. So, let me find it. Here. So this is a photo of the protest that I'm going to read a poem about, and I made it to the local news. So this is a screenshot of the local news photo. The other thing the poem talks about are these puzzles my kids had when they were little that had like fire engine trucks and other pieces on them. And when you took the pieces off, they made noise because they were light sensitive. So it's about these puzzles. Okay, that was a really long intro. Light sensitive puzzle piece. At the protest where everyone was outraged about children in cages, A guy who looked vaguely like Jesus was holding a Keep Families Together sign, and a woman who wanted to speak was holding a megaphone, then said, "I've never used one of these things. How does it work?" And her friend with the Love Thy Neighbor, No Exception sign said, "Hold it closer to your mouth." And she did. And while she was speaking, pickups drove by with enormous Trump flags. Pickups drove by blasting aggressive country, God bless the USA. And I couldn't stop looking at Protest Jesus's work boots, his cut-off homemade tank top. I was holding a sign sharpied on the back of a pizza box from 4 protests ago that said "Child of a Refugee" with a red arrow pointing to me. And I stood near 3 women with small cages for rabbits, birds, gerbils that each held dolls. One was a Cabbage Patch Kid with blonde braids. Since protest as mixed media sculpture is a thing now, even in Appalachia, and there was a toddler wearing a Superman shirt, holding a rainbow "Superman was a refugee" poster, and his father was holding him on his shoulders. Some nights when it was late and my sons were small and asleep in their beds, I'd turn off all the lights in the house, and suddenly the sound of a train or a cow or cricket, something moving and alive from their puzzles, would speak when you shifted a piece off or put one back on. This inanimate thing made animate by light would utter ghost sounds. The reporter from the local paper asked me why I was there on the sidewalk. So I told her about my mother and the DP camps. I told her only a small part of the story, but she still looked shocked. To hold is to bear the weight of a person or thing, to grasp or carry or support with our arms, to embrace someone, to keep or detain someone. There's the hold of a ship or remaining secure and intact in a position, to maintain a connection until the person on the phone line is free to speak, to have in your possession the act of grasping something, a degree of power or control. The last Shoah survivors are nearly gone, so they've made holograms to tell their stories to school children and museum visitors, but it's not the same. We respond to the sound of an actual human voice attached to a body, which means when the next woman with the megaphone in an ecumenical collar starts to read the last 4 lines of Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus, there's not a dry eye on the sidewalk in front of our local congressional office. The congressman who is away, the congressman who got teary, who looked me in the eye and said, that kind of persecution could only happen in Germany, when I told him my family story, refugee from Fujio, to flee or escape from this to that. Our meeting was a season before Nazis marched through Charlottesville and the rabbis pulled the Torah scrolls from the building and someone was killed, and I began quizzing my sons on our full names, addresses, phone numbers. Superman, born Kal-El on the planet Krypton, was rocketed to Earth by his father unaccompanied, alone as an infant, moments before the destruction of his planet. It was months before anger turned to panic, then to fear. And here we are, the dislodged pieces, shoulder to shoulder, light sensitive and bleating into the deep night. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I saw that poem, I think, when it first came out, which published on which site was it published? I'm forgetting now.
The Jewish Book Council actually published it. It was supposed to come out in their paper journal, the Paper Brigade, but they've been slowly running everything out online so that everyone can read it.
No, that was great. And yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm the grandchild of 3 refugees myself, so that's, struck a chord, and I'm sure a lot of people here today are in a similar situation.
It's so funny because my mom she was born in a displaced persons camp after my grandparents were liberated from Auschwitz. And I said to her, I'm the daughter of a refugee. And she's like, who's the refugee? Like, she just doesn't, that's not how she thinks of herself. To her, that's like very dire or sounds very dire in a way that she doesn't picture herself. And I'm like, you know, and I think a lot of, I think in some ways that's a testament for a long time to how, you know, comfortable families became in both Israel and the US. Since we've been here at this point. My mom emigrated in 1952 from the DP camp to the US. And so it's funny to me that it's something, I can see the family trauma, and my sister and I can very clearly see the 3G Holocaust trauma that's still running through our family in various ways, that's, I think, been torqued up for many people now with the pandemic in terms of, you know, like food, because my grandparents were starved. Food and food security was a really big thing in my family for years. So my husband, who has a really different background and grew up in the Midwest, thought I was crazy when I started, you know, filling our pantry in a particular way.
Oh my God.
Same thing. And so I think for a lot of people, the pandemic has reactivated old family traumas connected to fleeing, escaping, Holocaust stuff, everything.
Oh, yeah, I totally relate. And I think, I mean, a lot of people are sending messages that they like the poem, and I'm sure that they felt in a similar way. And
can I say something? Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, it looks like Bill Friedman has a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, first of all, it's a lovely reading. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Since place is so important to you, I'm wondering why you live where you live. Since you apparently don't belong there, I think there must be a poem in Why I Live Where I Don't Belong. And that's one question. The other is, in the first poem, is there a connection between the Trojan and the G string?
So that's a great question, and a question my mother asks me often. So academia, I'm a professor right now at Virginia Tech, and so is my husband. And academia is kind of like the domestic foreign service. The job market is so bad that you go where the work is. And for both of us to be able to have jobs at the same place is actually pretty unusual. There's about usually 18 or 20 job listings in my field every year. And so, and getting a job like the one I have is very difficult. And so that's why I live down here, is for the work. And the fact that both of us have jobs here. And as to your second question, so what happens when we have football games here, and particularly when we win, is all the college students go out at night. They go crazy. I don't even know what they're doing, but clearly they're having sex in public places, and stuff gets left around on the sidewalks. And so, so one of the things that was so shocking, obviously, like when you're chaperoning a class trip, and you see some of this stuff, your first thought is like, cover everyone's eyes, no. And then you realize the kids have no idea what it is anyway. And so luckily no one asked about either of those things. You know, like I was just waiting for one kid to be like, you know, Oz's mom, what's that? You know, because, you know, all the little kids refer to you as your kid's name and then mom or dad. No one actually knows your name. So it's, that was what that was about.
Well, it's an old Greek state and a string on the cello.
And a brand of condom here.
While you're thinking about location, someone pointed out to me that we actually got a question through Facebook by Barry Alpert. And he wanted to know how you would compare the poetic possibilities of Charlottesville and Blacksburg.
So it's interesting. I lived in Charlottesville for many years. I lived there about 7 or 8 years. And when all the white supremacist protests happened in Charlottesville, the one thing that was so striking to me was Rabbi Tom, who's the rabbi there, was actually my classmate in my PhD program. So I knew him quite well, and I knew the congregation. And seeing the news reports that he was taking the Torah scrolls out of the building is like, that's something that to me harkens back to Nazi Germany. Like, you don't take the Torah scrolls out of the building unless something is really in danger. But to answer that question in terms of Charlottesville versus Blacksburg, Charlottesville,
possibilities.
Poetic possibilities. I think it's interesting because Charlottesville has a ton of American history and racial history tied up in the site. In similar ways, I think, you know, that Jerusalem has an incredible amount of history that's pertinent to both religious history for a lot of different religions and the history of Israel as a whole. Charlottesville, in terms of the history of America and its racial history, is a really loaded place because of Thomas Jefferson and because of the university there. Blacksburg is a really different place in terms of the history. It's the Appalachian South and not the Gentile South. And it doesn't have the same, exactly the same history of, or at least as prominent of a history as a slaveholding area. And the university I teach at here is what's called a land grant university. So we have like majors in poultry science and meat sciences and other things. I think poetically for me, both were fruitful places. I think in being a white mother raising a Black child, so I have two sons. My oldest son is white and my youngest son is Black. And if I had been living in Charlottesville right now, the poems I'd be writing would be really different than the ones I'm writing now, which are still about raising one white son and one Black son in the American South. But the Appalachian South is different than Charlottesville South, even though we're about 2 hours apart. And so I think anytime you invoke or use place in your work, you have to be really aware of the baggage it comes with. It doesn't mean you have to always address the baggage in each poem, but you have to be aware of the underpinnings and history, so that you're not either appropriating something or overlooking something in creating your work. And so Blacksburg is much easier in the sense that it's a much newer place that doesn't have the same kind of racial historical baggage that Charlottesville does. So for me, it's an easier place to use as a setting for poems, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers the question.
Cool. So yeah, wow. I guess we also went way over, so I'm gonna try to wrap it up now. But thank you so much. It's funny to, you know, you came to talk to us here a little about Israel, and now we're learning, I think, about the difference of Charlottesville and Appalachia, and to start thinking about where you're coming from and over there, which is really nice. With all that in mind, I just wanted to wrap up by first of all saying thank you, first and foremost, to Erika for taking the time to talk to us and to read for us. It was really great. I hope you have time to go through the chat and see all the amazing comments and gratitude that you're getting for talking to us. I also want to give a shout out to a few people that helped make this happen. You might not see is Penina, who's been helping, making a lot of posts. Maybe you saw also she made on Instagram. We'll probably get it on Facebook. She worked with Roni Garson Monka, my wonderful, talented wife, did a lot of drawing. It went along with one of Erika's poems that was shared online. You can see that also. I hope to find more ways to share that. Also, Reuven.
The drawings were beautiful. Thank you.
Also, Reuven helped with the technical stuff today, and also with just planning for all this. And thanks for everybody for coming out. This would have, you know, I think Erika mentioned early on that the kind of feedback online is something we're all adjusting to, and we didn't get to hear a lot of you, but we get to see a lot of you that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, and it wouldn't have been the same thing without all of you here, so thanks for coming out. Also, like I said earlier, this is the first of 6 sessions. Next week, around this time, I think an hour later, will be with Charles Bernstein, and then we have some other amazing authors, David Kaplan, Adina Karasak, Alicia Ostreicher, and Jake Marmers, like this whole month and a half of just awesome Jerusalem online meetings. And another thing is right now we're trying to raise money to build a website. So please feel free to check out the Jerusalem Patreon and consider supporting some of these grassroots literary efforts. And again, thanks everybody. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all next week. Erika, I don't know if you want to say any last.
Thank you everyone who helped make this possible. This was so cool to do this for a lot of people who are tuning in from everywhere, but especially from Israel. So I'm really, really glad I got to do this and not have to take a 13-hour plane flight to do it as much as I'd love to see my family in Israel. So, and my friends there, because, you know, El Al Coach is not fun.
Could you just give us
Thank you.
the name of the person who does the How to Write Nature Poetry?
Yes, it's up. If you scroll up in the chat, you'll find it. Her name is Amy Nezekuma Tatil. So I'll type it one more time in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, a few times I've seen people do this at other Zoom meetings. I'll just maybe like unmute everyone and you can get a big, fun, cacophonous yelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie and everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. You all were a great audience. I appreciate how engaged everybody was.
Mm-hmm.